Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just making sure everybody had a chance to join, and so happy that you are here with us. My name is Steph McGraw. I am the president of the Alumni Association at the University of King's College, and I want to welcome you to the first session of Kings in Conversation. So this is a webinar series that we're kicking off today of important discussions organized by alumni for alumni and friends, of course, of the university, both near and far. Just as a note, this session is being recorded and will be available on the King's website afterwards. Before we get started, let's take a moment to acknowledge we are guests on these lands. Kings and Halifax, Kjipuktuk sit on unceded Mi'kmaq land in Mi'kma'ki. African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched Mi'kma'ki and Nova Scotia for over 400 years. We also acknowledge the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land called Canada and honor the self-determination and sovereignty of all Indigenous nations and peoples. Before we get going, I wanted to say how excited I am by this topic. Jen Hollett, who's on the panel, and I began our careers in journalism and the music industry at a time of turmoil, very much like this. I will say, although times may seem confusing for people in the journalism world, in the news world, Jen and I are proof that you can get through it, and there are ways for us to think about how we look at disruption in an interesting, educated way. There will be challenges, but of course, great opportunities as well. So I'm so excited to hear from the full panel, and I think this is such a valuable discussion. Moderating today's conversation, we have Trina Roche, and I'll turn it over for her to get started. Thank you so much.
Walal and Steph, Upjalida, welcome everyone. Today we gather for a discussion about the Canadian Online News Act and its implication for news media outlets and everyday Canadians. My dad still gets the newspaper delivered to his door, but I'm well aware that most Canadians are getting their news online. In 2022, online advertising revenues in Canada were $14 billion. Search and social media platforms made up the bulk of those revenues. Newsrooms, however, are closing and cutting back, and the Canadian government says that's due in large part to a loss of advertising revenue. The Online News Act, also known as Bill C-18, was passed in June, requiring tech giants like Meta and Google to pay for the content from news outlets. But shortly after passing the bill, Meta and Google announced that rather than pay, they would block news in Canada across their platforms. That move flies in the face of the intention of the bill, which aims, and I'm quoting here from the Canadian press release, to ensure fairness in the Canadian digital news marketplace and for independent local news businesses, including rural and remote news organizations, by ensuring that news, media, and journalists receive fair compensation for their work. And all of that's happening against a backdrop of declining news media profits, continued layoffs, diminishing public trust, and dwindling audiences. Now facing uncertainty in how Canadians will access their news and how news outlets are responding, we're joined today by 5 influential journalism and news media personalities across Canada. So I'll ask each of the panelists to give a wave as I introduce them. Emma Gilchrist is co-founder, editor-in-chief, and executive director of The Narwhal, a nonprofit online magazine that publishes in-depth and investigative journalism about the natural world in Canada. Before The Narwhal, Emma worked at newspapers and magazines in the UK and Canada, including a stint as an environment reporter at the Calgary Herald. Jennifer Hollett is the executive director at The Walrus, Canada's Conversation. The Walrus is known for its award-winning independent journalism, fact-checking, and national ideas-focused events. Prior to this role, Jennifer was the head of news and government at Twitter Canada and has worked as a journalist with CBC, CTV, and Chum. Karen Pugliese is a member of the Algonquin of Pikwakanagan First Nation in Ontario and currently the editor-in-chief at Canadaland, a news site and podcast network that focuses on Canadian media, current affairs, and politics. Previously, she was the editor-in-chief of Canada's National Observer, managing editor of investigations at CBC, and the executive director of news and current affairs at APTN, the Aboriginal People's Television Network. Matthew Demera is an award-winning editor and journalist currently living in Toronto and is the founder of The Resolve. Most recently, they were the managing editor at Extra, where they drove new and innovative digital-only editorial and engagement strategies, and the acting editor-in-chief at Rabble.ca, where they led strategy for an editorial refocusing and relaunch. And Tai Huynh is the founding editor-in-chief and publisher of The Local, an award-winning digital magazine covering community issues in Toronto, an independent magazine exploring urban health and social issues in Toronto. He writes occasionally about urban health and inequality. So in today's discussion, we'll cover what the Online News Act means for Canadian media. And if any of you, our audience, have questions, we invite you to share them at any time using the Q&A function, and then we'll get to those questions at the end of our discussion. But I'll get us started. Each of you represents a key news outlet in Canada, and I know this issue has been top of mind for you. What's the one message you want to make sure that you share today? And maybe we can start with you, Jennifer.
It is the best of times and the worst of times to be working in journalism right now in Canada. So if anyone tuning in takes one thing away, would be that we need trustworthy news. And it's becoming harder to find, partially due to the Online News Act, but also other factors as well. So find a news outlet that you trust and support, bookmark it, join the newsletter, and contribute, whether that's becoming a member or making a donation or getting a subscription, because we have an opportunity in front of us right now to support and create a news ecosystem that really strengthens democracy in this country.
I'll just go around the circle. Karen, you're next on my screen.
Okay, I think Jennifer said it so well. I think, when I think about the worst part of what's happening in news, it is the impact that it has on democracy. It is the impact that we have to hear from other people in the country. I think a lot about my time in an APTN and how influential APTN was about changing the conversation about Indigenous people. We'll probably focus a lot today because a lot of these conversations have focused on print media. But we've got to remember that broadcast media also is losing advertisers. There's cable company cutting as things go online. And, broadcast media, radio and television is also in danger.
Tai.
Yeah, it's looking pretty grim, I think, for small independent outlets like us. Already, Meta's blocked news. I think all of our outlets represented here have been blocked. And so that for us, it's about 20% of our traffic. And if Google does the same as it's threatening to do, that's probably another 40% for us. So that's a massive hit. I think it's going to be pretty similar for all outlets across the country. So it's it's not looking good if things kind of go down this path. So I do hope there's a quick turnaround sometime over the next month. I think that's when the regulations are supposed to become enacted. So there's still some time for us to turn the ship around, I think.
Emma, a key message that you would, sort of hope to get across today.
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Jennifer said. I mean, it's really important for outlets to build a direct relationship with their audience, right? And it's especially important for audiences in this moment to make sure that they are getting tapped into the outlets directly, especially for us smaller independent outlets. The impacts of the Online News Act could be, they're existential. Of us either being left out, not treated fairly, of the kind of playing field being tilted, or the ultimate kind of disaster scenario in which Canadians just can't find news anywhere that they go to look for it. So it is really concerning. At the same time, I think with every challenge or attack, there is also an opportunity, and all of the kind of best moments of the narwhal have come on the heels of the worst moments. And so even in this moment, when we can't reach, readers in the places where we used to get the majority of our audience, we've been able to kind of take that, and we have a new pop-up on our website, for instance, that is converting at 250% higher than the normal pop-up. And that's really getting people onto our newsletter in this moment. So I do think, despite the dire straits out there, there are opportunities to kind of capitalize anytime you're under attack as well.
Thank you. And Matthew.
I mean, this is absolutely a moment of crisis. And I talked to a lot of other folks who are in my situation as, editors or publishers of small publications, startups, those types of things. And there's still I'm feeling a lot of optimism. I don't know that it's warranted optimism, but from crisis, from like in the moments where you rebuild, in the moments there are opportunities often for change and growth and new ways of doing things. So I think as bad as things are, it is a moment for us to be optimistic, I think, but I think there's like a cautious optimism to be had in terms of, I think this really requires people to be engaged, and like we need folks to be paying attention and advocating for media, for whatever outlets you follow, whatever journalism is important to you in your communities. I think like the Online News Act and some of the other, this isn't the only crisis I think that journalism is facing. It's really going to require like people to be engaged and to care about the news that happens in their community, because I think this could be an opportunity, or it could be like a bad moment. Like it could be the beginning of the end for a lot of burgeoning media. So it's a time for us to, I think, pay a lot more attention to journalism. And like Karen mentioned, we're often talking about digital media, but broadcast and print, and we're all in different spaces, and this is all affecting us in different ways. But I think, again, it is a moment of crisis for sure.
When Meta and Google announced that instead of paying, they'd block news content on their platforms in Canada, it sent many news outlets scrambling to maintain that connection to their audience. So I'm just curious, like how everyone has adjusted, like what workarounds have you come up with, whether it's like Narwhal has a newsletter or like Globe and Mail has an app. So maybe we can start with you, Ty. So what have you been focusing on to sort of work around what's been happening?
I mean, for sure, newsletter, right? Like Emma said, we prioritize newsletter subscription in terms of pop-ups and stuff like that. And that's really, I think, work well for us. But there is no making up for that kind of volume loss, right? Especially from Facebook. So right now we're covering another election in Toronto, the third election we've covered in the last year. It's kind of insane. It's a small election in just one of the wards. And a lot of people share election news at the ward level actually through Facebook groups, right? And the fact that our coverage now cannot be shared is it's a pretty dramatic difference compared to like a year ago when we covered the first the first election in October. So we're finding other ways that we partner with the Toronto Public Library, which is the largest library system in Canada, to put our content in physical print format, like, which is insane. Like, we're supposed to be digital only. Like, we're putting these printed versions in their branches, right, to reach folks. We're creating PDF documents just today to circulate among kind of civic organizations locally so they can share it, and creating a link to the document on a Google Drive so that our URL doesn't get blocked on Facebook, because they are blocking that. Even though we're not sharing it, anybody sharing anything that's the local.to, it's going to be blocked. So yeah, I'm not sure how well it's all going to work, but again, there's no making up for the volume loss from a Facebook ban for sure.
Matthew, you talked about like sort of this, there's optimism, but it's kind of grim, like we're just at a crisis. But do you have workarounds? Like what have you been sort of doing to reach an audience?
I mean, we haven't figured out a perfect solution or something that is making up for all the audience loss for sure. And I think in some respects, we're kind of taking it slow. We invested a lot of time into like Instagram specifically, just because it was a great way to reach some younger audiences. And like, and I say invest, we spent time, we spent money. And so there's not like a real urgency on our part in to invest in another platform. So we absolutely are using things like email, newsletters. But again, those skew older. So it's not really like a replacement for what's been lost. I think what we're sort of looking at now mostly is we're really looking at like in-person events. And I think like Ty's talking about print, doing print, and we're really trying to figure again how to connect with people where they are. And if people aren't on these platforms, if people are on platforms where we don't have an opportunity to be involved, then we're looking for other opportunities. But I think I think we've talked a lot about engaging more on TikTok, for example, but again, these platforms come and go, and there's, we don't know all of a sudden if TikTok suddenly gets captured by the Online News Act, we'll be in the same situation again. So we're really trying to look at other opportunities. We are part of a new collective. It's called unrigged.ca. It just launched, and it's a collective of about 20 plus left-leaning progressive publications, and it's really just a news aggregation site. And it's not a perfect workaround, but we really are trying to find new ways of working together with other publications who are in the same situation as us.
I'm going to jump in because you mentioned events, and we've been doing events at the Walrus. I think we're best known for the Walrus Talks for over a decade. And what's been hard for us is we can't promote our events on Facebook and Instagram like we used to, or the podcasts, which we're doing more and more of. So it's not just traditional news articles. It's actually our domains as news organizations have been blocked. And Meta would tell you that's a compliance approach. So what's great about all of these workarounds is it's new ways to find audiences. But again, a lot of people go to social media to figure out what they're going to do on any given night, whether that's join a live stream like this one or go out in person and check out a cool event in the city. So we started with education. Not everyone knows about the latest bill or Online News Act. I mean, we talk about this a lot because it's our business, but explaining, what this is, how it's rolling out. Also, the last few months, it's looked different for all of us. So for example, you might find your content blocked on web and not on mobile. Some of your social media producers might be able to post something, others not, right? Because it's been rolling out. So there's been some confusion there. Also, if you're able to post, our audiences outside of Canada can still see the content on Facebook and Instagram. And we have an international audience and Canadians in the diaspora who are interested in our work. So that's a bit confusing. But we started by explaining what the Online News Act is and encouraging our audience, as mentioned, to sign up for a newsletter, but also to use like an old school bookmark and visit walrus.ca regularly for content. We also are really leaning into media relations, which is to get coverage of the work that we're doing, especially when our news makes news, and partnerships. So yeah, I love that creative example, Matthew, of orgs supporting each other. And I have to say there's a lot of good relations and will within this group, because ultimately we're all in it together, however it plays out. And I think anytime I see a story that people are talking about, that's a win for all of us.
Emma, maybe to you, because it is part of that, it's getting content, because we are public service, right? We have important information and stories that we want to share, but it's also about getting content in a way that generates revenue, which might be sort of the challenge. But Emma, what is the Narwhal sort of doing to navigate this?
Yeah, I mean, so far, we haven't actually lost a ton of traffic due to the Online News Act so far. It's a somewhat counterintuitive thing to say, but for us, the reality was that back in 2019, 50% of our traffic came from Facebook. But Facebook has been slowly closing the taps on news for several years. And so by 2023, only 5% of our traffic was coming from Facebook anyways. Now, so we've lost that 5%. We really had put a lot of effort into building an audience on Instagram. We do a lot of visual journalism. That was an audience that mostly engaged like in that platform. So that is probably the largest loss to us at this point, is losing that audience, which was younger and more diverse than that kind of typical newsletter audience. So we are like playing around with TikTok as, the next thing to try. I will say, like it kind of strikes me as I listen to it all, I'm like, I've been in the industry for 20 years now, and people have been talking about, the end of journalism and the crisis in Canadian journalism that entire time. And there's like a different flavor, like every year of the last 20 years. Not to diminish the current crisis that we're in, but, I think about like early in my career, I was so frustrated that newspapers weren't evolving. They weren't adapting to the time. And, just as then, like it's still our job to adapt and be creative and do whatever it is that we need to do, right? So for us, in addition to kind of some of the things I've talked about, really testing our pop-ups, getting more people into our newsletter list, et cetera, kind of capitalizing on the moment, we're definitely putting more of an emphasis on partnerships like Jennifer was talking about. So for instance, we have a reporter who we share with the Winnipeg Free Press, and all of their reporting is published both in the newspaper and on the Narwhal. And so, as a nonprofit news outlet that doesn't run any advertising, like we're really focused around the impact of that work, right? And so we're looking at creative ways to make sure that that impact happens when we can't necessarily get in front of as many new eyeballs as we once did. A huge proportion of our traffic now comes from Google. And, if we were to lose Google, then, everybody's going to be in huge trouble. So it might just kind of wipe the slate clean and we'll start all over again on the Online News Act. I don't know what it'll look like. I try not to spend too much of my time like catastrophizing, because I'm just like, I don't know. I don't know if there's going to be a scenario where like that happens to everybody in Canada. It doesn't make any sense that we end up in that place for long.
It's funny, like 20 years and I'm over 20 years now in journalism, and did start before Facebook. So we did exist. How did I get a hold of people? We certainly I'm sure can find an innovative way forward. Karen, what about Canada Land? Like how are you sort of navigating this, having your content blocked?
Well, Canada Land's a little bit different because Facebook just wasn't feeding into us, right? Like as a podcast, the discoverability was more on Apple. Now there's stuff that's, as the government's looking at new legislation, there's this whole thing that's happening with Apple that might just repeat what's been happening with Facebook and Google. So I mean, like we have some strategies, like we're looking at feed swaps with some American companies and stuff like that to expand our audience, not just because of what's happening with online media, but because we do want to expand the business and the audience, and discoverability is a huge thing. And I think what I'd say just generally about some of the issues that are happening with the blocking of news on Facebook is Emma's quite right. When I was at National Observer, we'd also noticed a dropping off. The algorithm had been punished over a number of years. And so, Facebook at one point, I guess last year, said, well, news doesn't even really matter to us. Well, it didn't matter to them at that point because they punished the algorithm so much that was no longer really a factor in, figuring into their business model. But that was because they changed the game. I don't think it was because people were not looking at news on Facebook, because the numbers we had in newsrooms, showed that people were engaging with that content and wanted that content. So they've kind of like done it very slowly. I think it's in December, Google has said that if things go ahead the way they are, it's December 19th, they have to implement this act, and that's the shut-off day for Google unless something changes between now and then. I think for new media coming up, discoverability is going to be the hardest thing. All of the new media that came up to replace the legacy media, like all the entrepreneurs that you're seeing, all to some extent use social media to launch us. I don't know how anybody who's coming up now that has an idea that wants to open a new newsroom can possibly promote themselves. Just in terms of other strategies, though, I've seen people try to do workarounds. I've seen them on TikTok, and TikTok, you can still post your news from TikTok onto Facebook. They haven't blocked that yet. I've seen people cut and paste like their whole stories into the Facebook status update, people taking screenshots of news and putting it on. But the big problem is you can't link back to the site, and then that interferes with the monetization. So you can still kind of have the discoverability, but driving people back to the site is the problem.
And that is I know I was going to ask about that because I saw a lot of people sort of finding ways to cheat around, but I was just going to say it doesn't link back to the site, so it's not really a solution. Long before the Online News Act, audiences had moved to social media platforms to acquire their news, especially younger audiences, which some of you have mentioned, that there is like age differences in terms of how people are finding you or how people are consuming their news. Did news outlets become too reliant on social media platforms to connect with their audience? Like our news audience, were news outlets sort of remiss in maybe not thinking about their use of Facebook or other platforms? Maybe we can start with Jennifer.
So when I was growing up in St. Catharines, Ontario, for me, when I was 12, the dream job was delivering the local newspaper because it was a job, there were tips. But my best friend, Melissa, she had the newspaper route because it was handed down in her family, sibling to sibling. But like this was the job, and this is how we got the news. It was extremely convenient. You would come home from work and your local newspaper would be on your doorstep. And to the point, I remember when she delivered the news, because sometimes I would help her out. Oh, well, this person has to be here in the mailbox. That person has, like, you would even, like the delivery person literally would, because you get better tips when you would go and you would collect, and they would collect. That was convenience at the time, right? That's where people would go for their news. They would also turn on the radio. They would tune into their favorite TV station. And we now have so many options, so many places to get our news. And I think what's great about that choice is we have a diversification in sources and in voices. You have mainstream outlets, you have indie outlets, the discoverability. And that's why I'm still on X. I call it Twitter. I used to work at Twitter, and every day X dies a new death. Like any journalist that emails X gets a poop emoji reply. Talk about a platform that has no respect for journalists or news. Yet it's still one of my favorite sources of conversation and news, because when it breaks, I know there's going to be something instantly on Twitter. So I think it's our job as publishers, as editors, we always have to see where people are looking for information, where people are getting their news, and figure out how we can connect to that. And it's always changing. But I think if we think back to the days of, the newspaper, delivery kid, it was around convenience. It was around community. It just takes place in different forms. Also, it's changing so fast. So I think while we're talking about the Online News Act, that conversation should have taken place a decade ago. We need to be talking about AI. That's our biggest challenge right now, as well, possible opportunity.
Anyone else? Maybe Ty, do you have thoughts on that sort of relationship between social media and news? And was there enough thought to that relationship maybe on the news side?
I mean, X or Twitter was our bread and butter early on. That's kind of how the audiences discovered us. So on X or on Twitter. In hindsight, maybe we should have invested more effort into, let's say, growing our newsletter audience. I don't think we prioritize that too much, probably assuming these things would keep doing what they're doing, like doing their magic in terms of driving traffic towards us. So yeah, maybe we could have been more thoughtful around, planning around some of these contingency strategies and not put all your eggs in the social media basket. But yeah, here we are.
I would just say, like, the narwhal wouldn't have come into being without social media and the access that we got on social media. Like, so, and we always did put a focus on growing our newsletter too, but, you know, and I think this is the most concerning thing about the Online News Act, right? Is like the prevention of new outlets from even getting going. You know, because in the beginning, it was just me and my co-founder, Carol Linnett, and we were making like funny news analysis videos and putting them out on Facebook and going viral on Facebook. And that's how we built an audience and got like takeoff velocity to grow the Narwhal to the point that it's at now with 22 staff. And yeah, I just don't know how you could do that without that reach. And I don't know, like at the end of the day, you have to meet audiences where they're at. And, you know, they're on social media and they're on Google. So that's where, you know, what's going on, it just kind of fundamentally does break the system. It's like, I love hearing about really cool stuff, like what Ty is doing and what I know, like Jeremy Clauseless over at The Sprawl is doing, like going back to print, getting out in the community, doing events, like Jennifer was mentioning, right? Like, so there are all these novel ways we can try to meet people where they are, but they are still on social media a lot. And it's ultimately our audiences, like, yeah, you know, we're wringing our hands about it, but our audiences are losing out, right? Like Canadians are losing out because now, you know, everybody's still scrolling their Instagram, but they're not getting any real news. And, you know, what they might be getting on news adjacent topics is from non-news sources, which is really super concerning, I think, in terms of like the spread of misinformation, is that you've taken away all of the credible news and now like you're just left with whatever's left after that, right? So yeah, I don't know that we really could have done anything different, aside from like not do it at all.
It is where the audience lives, right? We go where the audience is going to be. So yeah, it makes sense. Anyone else? Karen, did you have thoughts on that sort of relationship with social media? And you know, would you do anything different? You're muted.
It's hard to imagine like how you could have done it differently. I mean, really the way this evolved is nobody really predicted that what social media was going to be, or that this was going to happen, or this is where news was going to end up going in this way. And so when it started to happen, like the industry was just trying to catch up and trying to figure out how we're going to use this. And we were all told, you know, you need to meet the audience where they're at. And so if Facebook was the big thing, you had to be on Facebook. And then there's a while where everybody's crazy, you have to be on Snapchat. That's where all the kids are. And you had all these execs running around going, where are all the kids? We have to find out where the kids are so we can be there and put news in front of them and get them to read it. So, I mean, like it wasn't well thought out. But on the other hand, people were cutting cords. Advertisers were moving out of the media as we knew it, and we were looking for the audiences, and we had to go where the audiences were, and they were online. So we didn't really have a choice. Like there was really no alternative. I think though, like in the execution of this bill and where we've ended up, you know, as much as like we're trying to figure out how we could have done things differently, you know, there's also a question, what is the responsibility of these media platforms? Because it's one thing for them to say, okay, I don't like the bill. I want to argue with the government about it. I want to handle it this way. I want to protest it. I want to launch a court case against it. Like there's all these tools that they can use in a democracy. But when they actually start banning organizations off their platform that are there for social good, you have to question the morality of the social media platforms and their CEOs and the decisions that they're making. So there's only so much, you know, beating up, I think, that we can do on ourselves.
Yeah, I feel too like I've just from people comments that people have made, like not everybody understands what's happening, or they'll blame the Canadian government. There seems to be a misunderstanding of what the bill is even doing or Meta's response. But Matthew, do you like have, I mean, as you are digital, right? So obviously social media is kind of important. You know, how important is it in that relationship, like for you in terms of reaching an audience? And would you do anything different or to navigate that? Or do you have thoughts on the media reliance on social media in the past?
I mean, it was a two-way street. I mean, social media offered a lot to news platforms, and they were actively inducing journalists to be there. And now that they've changed their mind, it's sort of like, well, I think the problem is we treat these spaces like they're public spaces, and often they've been this place for public conversation, but they're privately owned. And so I think there's a question here about like social media as a public good, and specifically news as a public good, I think. And so we have these blurrings of profit, and like we have, I think many of the publications here are nonprofit publications, not all. But I think when we have this this, I think Karen was talking about morality, and there is no morality in corporations. Corporations are about profit. And so the instant profit contradicts the idea of public good, profit wins. And so I think what we kind of need to be looking at in terms of solutions is how do we make sure that journalism is something that is publicly accessible? For us, like we always use these platforms specifically because we weren't necessarily interested in monetizing the audience for advertising. We were interested in reaching people where they were. And so like platforms like Instagram were really important for us. I mentioned Age, but not just Age. Like that's where we found Black youth. That's where we found like Indigenous youth. These are where they're most active in these places. And so it doesn't seem like Meta's coming back. It seems like this is maybe a very permanent thing. But I think, there's the question of how this affects our survival as institutions, and like, whether platforms will survive. But I think maybe more importantly is we're losing access to people, and people are losing access to the news. People who maybe don't have the same memories of the newspaper coming to their door. And so like that relationship with news isn't as clearly developed as it was for maybe some of us older folks. And so that's what I worry about, is that news won't be as integral to people's day-to-day lives. And it really is important. I think, it's not just that people need to read the news every day. It's in those moments of crisis. It's when things are happening in their community. We saw it with like the wildfires over the summer. And we, Ty mentioned local elections. These are the places where it's really, I think, harmful to people, to especially, to whether it's a local community or, an entire province. So I don't know what the answer is. And I don't know that there's any like getting this back in the bottle. But I think we should be trying to maybe looking at more creative solutions as to what comes next. Because I don't think it's a matter of just whether we can get Google or Meta back at the table. It's a question of like these things should just be publicly accessible. And how do we do that? So if it's not on these platforms, what platforms could it be? You're still muted.
Oh, I've only been doing Zoom for 3 years. Maybe we can pick up with that, because it is, it is about, reaching an audience, but it's also about funding models, right? Like that's how newsrooms survive. Like news costs money to produce. So maybe we can talk about that. Maybe Karen, I'll go back to you. In terms of funding models or arrangements, like how are you? I mean, because you guys, it's like CBC is a public broadcaster. Narwhal, I think you have a membership model. Canada Land is funded by its audience. So maybe we can start with you, Karen, in terms of what that sort of looks like going forward to survive.
Yeah, well, Canada Land's funded by its audience, and also we do some advertising as well. So that's definitely a part of it. Going forward to survive on, that's the question, right? Like to kind of, I guess, back up on the history of this. When this bill first came forward, because I came from kind of a broadcast kind of background, it almost made sense to me that the government could do something like this. When it was first kind of pitched, what do you think about this idea? The government's thinking of getting platforms to pay. Well, a big part of the business model when you're in broadcast is that cable companies pay television stations for the to carry their material, to carry their station. And so they get, when you subscribe, or when you used to subscribe, if anybody does anymore, to cable, some of those, somebody does, I don't even anymore, because I feel so ashamed of myself. But so some of that money from every bill that you paid went to CTV, CBC, APTN, like every other station, for the privilege of carrying them. Because clearly you're not going to buy cable if there's nothing on it. So the idea that advertisers had left legacy media and were buying all their ads digitally, and now news was going onto those platforms, but not having lost its advertising and then not benefiting from the advertising that the platforms were making because people were looking at the content on the platform, if you know what I mean. The idea was that they would pay something back. So this initially kind of made sense to me. Maybe there was another way to do it. But if we're not going to do that, we have to go chasing advertising again. We have to go appealing to people for people-powered media. You know, like journalism will not pay for itself, and it will not be done for free. So, you know, at the end of the day, those are two of the things. I mean, the other thing is that we know the government has stepped in to fund media. I'm not in favor of that. I mean, there's questions that people have about whether that's creates bias or the appearance of bias, but even more than that, I just don't think it's sustainable. I mean, we all know that there are, you know, depending what party is in, they support that or they don't support it. Pierre Poilievre has said if he gets elected federally, which he might, that he's going to cut that program, and so many media have already become dependent on it, that there will be layoffs, and there's so many layoffs happening already. So I think it really has to be people powered. It has to be some advertising if we can get it back. But the good news is with the smaller companies and the not-for-profits, the not-for-profits can get some money out of foundations, which I think a lot of people are doing. And I think the other thing is we don't have like hedge funds owning us, and we don't have these big boards or shareholders that we have to pay. So you do get more money going straight into journalism. So you're getting more bang for your buck off of the smaller media. And maybe that's just like the model of the future, that it's all very small. And you know, unfortunately, I don't know how you fund the national media then.
Ty, how do you sort of see your like potential ideas for funding and maybe for the local, like in your experience? How are you seeing yourself going forward?
Yeah, I guess the financial underpinning of the Online News Act is advertising dollars, right? That's lost, and now, you know, government wants to have a way to channel it back. So when we started in 2019, I mean, advertising and journalism were already on this downward slope. So we didn't want to touch advertising, right? So we created the Local as an ad and paywall free outlet funded by readers and funded by philanthropy, really, as a nonprofit. So that, yeah, right from the beginning, like we didn't want anything to do with advertising. So this whole deal through the Online News Act it seemed immaterial to us at the time when I heard about it. Well, yeah, great, we can get some money from big tech. That's amazing. That's a bonus. But we never built that into our business model. That kind of dependency didn't make sense at all. But we didn't realize that the flip side of that is this potentiality for big tech to ban news altogether, so they wouldn't have to pay. And that's where it's hitting us, right? Like it's more on the audience side and not so much on the financial side, which, I mean, the audience side ultimately will lead to a big financial blow for us ultimately. But yeah, for us, I feel like we're kind of collateral damage, caught in this kind of war between legacy media, who were the big lobbyists for this legislation with the federal government, and big tech. So they're battling this out. And we're just, you know, on the sidelines here watching this and then feeling the effects of it ultimately in terms of the blockage of news. So yeah, that's kind of how we're seeing things. But we're still, you know, largely funded by you know, philanthropy, and you know, that seems to be working, you know, pretty well so far for us. And I hope that keeps up.
I would love to build off that. Like Ty, I'm so glad that you said that, because I was thinking something very similar, which is like, I don't think any of the people like on this panel were the ones like rattling the sabers for this legislation in the first place, right? You know, it was kind of premised upon this idea that newspapers had a God-given right to the advertising dollars, and like I fundamentally disagree with the premise of it. Many of us were involved with Press Forward, an association of independent media, who, you know, took a position arguing for a different type of model if the government did want to move forward with legislation. You know, that would have been more fair and more equitable. And we didn't get there, right? We've ended up with the really like the worst of all worlds, right? I think, yeah, when many of us started our outlets, like, you know, I never dreamt of getting money from social media giants, right? Like, I would be happy to turn back time and have those audiences back and be able to build an audience. And you know, I think I've always kind of preached that like at the end of the day, if you want to run a news organization, you have to have an audience, and you have to have a strong relationship with that audience, and you need to be able to convince them to be able to pay for it. And right now we are collateral damage in this larger war between legacy media, who were overly reliant on advertising, and essentially kind of, you know, lobbied for a bailout of their dying models. And we are caught in the crossfire of that. And it really hurts Canadians and those who are our audiences, who ultimately need the news that we're producing, right? So, I mean, that's my thought on business models, is we all innovated to come up with a business model that worked. And the government has gone to extreme lengths to try to bail out a business model that wasn't working. Not to, you know, I don't have an hour to talk about my thesis on this, and I don't mean to vastly oversimplify it, but that is certainly a dynamic that's at play.
Jennifer.
I just want to jump in quickly just to add to what Ty and Emma were saying. Like, let's also just be clear that legacy media were lobbying for this because they were the ones that were always going to benefit. So the point they're making, we lost access to audiences on social media. But on the flip side, if social media, like if Facebook hadn't pulled away, if Google wasn't pulling away, it wasn't like we were going to get tons of money. Like like it was going to be pennies for the startups. So this really is a war between the tech giants and legacy media.
And then we've seen in some of the reporting that most of the money, if it was to go through like it was originally envisioned, would go to CBC. So there's that playing it too, back to public media. But to your question, Trina, the Walrus, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. And I joke that 20 for some of us seems very young, but for independent media, wow, like what an accomplishment. And back in 2005, the team working at the Walrus had the vision to register us as a charity. And so we are a charity, we're a nonprofit business model with an educational mandate. But on top of that, then came events, partnerships, and sponsorships. And we've done events in partnership with Meta. We've done events in partnership with Google, but also with universities, with nonprofits. We're doing an event tomorrow night, the Walrus Talks Gender-Based Violence, with the Canadian Women's Foundation. That's been a big part of our business model. We also launched the Walrus Lab, where we work with brands on awards, custom events, content marketing, podcasts. And we also have donations and membership and a variety of ways to earn revenue. And we found that was really key, especially first year of the pandemic, when, oh, no more in-person events. We're all gonna go inside and figure out how to work and live life. Or there have been times when donations aren't coming in as much as they used to, or donations are going to other pressing issues and causes. So I think not only do you have a range of creative business cases here, but I think diversification is key in a changing landscape. If you think of the last 3 years, not only did we all navigate COVID, but there has also been supply chain issues. There's been the rise in the cost of living, but also the cost of doing business. We also have wars, plural. There's a lot going on. So I don't think any of us can rely on just one source of funding.
Matthew, did you have anything, you sort of, this question sort of came out of your comments, but did you have anything to add just about that sort of, you know, navigating going forward and not just reaching an audience, but actually in a way that that makes money for your newsroom?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I'm wrestling with a lot, and I still don't have an answer yet. I think, you know, this room is full of some like really great success stories in independent media. And I think from my perspective, it doesn't always scale. And so I think that's, I think, one of my concerns, because I have the same concerns that Karen does, which is I really worry about government funding, both the instability of it, and I also think there are issues with, I think it affects credibility, and I think it's harmful in other ways too. That said, it's really hard to create an independent media organization in this country. Where, you know, there are accelerators, or these programs that have come that sort of been exported over from the States, and it's not really working in a lot of ways. So, you know, the problem is bigger than we have time to talk about today. But, you know, member-supported journalism, I think, is a really great idea, but it doesn't work if the communities you're covering don't have money. Right? If you're trying to do this in a poorer community, a lower income community, the model doesn't work. If you're a national company like Canadaland or like the Narwhal, you have a bigger audience to pull from as well. So like there's more people to potentially reach. It's also hard to reach them, so it's not like an easy thing to do. But if you're trying to do a local news outlet in a small community, these things are really hard and tough. And so like I do think this is a conversation that needs to happen, looking at it from a broader lens of how do we make this work, because these legacy outlets are dying. And like there's just so many fewer journalists, again, as I mentioned before. And so we need things to replace these things. And we haven't really, as great as the independent what's popped up so far has been, we need more as well. And so whether it's government support, whether it's the money from Bill C-18, whether it's philanthropy, we really need to figure out how some of these things can be scaled, whether it's like scaled down for smaller communities, or whether it's for reaching things on a more national brand, a more national level. Philanthropy is also great, but we just don't have the same journalism as a philanthropy, as something you can donate money to is fairly new, the Walrus aside. Journalism as charity is very new. It's like a few years old here. So we don't have the same level of, like in the States, you have the Knight Foundation, because the press barons, when they were making lots of money, they created their own journalism foundations. We don't have journalism foundations in Canada. So there, you know, I think a lot of these things there's seeds of really great potential here, but we need to find ways that to make it work for every community that needs news, like all communities need news. I don't think that's a real question. So we need to find ways that this isn't just going to like replicate a lot of the same inequities that were happening before with legacy media, where rich communities have lots of journalism and poor communities have less or none.
There's so much. Maybe we're coming up to the hour, and I know we have one question from the audience, but maybe just some final thoughts on that, and how Canadians, because obviously news, as journalists and as editors and people running newsrooms, you know, we have things to figure out. But what maybe advice would you give to Canadians, either on how they can support or how they can just stay connected to news? What would you like to see Canadians sort of doing as consumers of news? Oh, and Karen, I forgot to pick someone.
Well, it just so happens that we're wrapping up a funding drive and we need 100 more subscribers to make our goal. So you can help. I mean, okay, aside from the shameless
Hey, you
plug
gotta
for Canada.
pitch. I respect it. It's National Philanthropy Day. Pitch away.
Yeah, subscribe to all of us. Come on. I mean, I like, honest to God, I joined up for Unrigged earlier today because I saw the news release come out, Matthew. So I'll be getting a stream from you. No, I mean, I think like there has to be an advocacy that it's important. Gonna have to pay for news while we're struggling to figure it out. And I think also, you know, one of the things that I'd really like to appeal is just be kind to journalists. there's a lot of beating up on journalists right now on social media for a variety of reasons. But one of them is people are complaining about shitty coverage of things. And some of that is shitty coverage of the war right now. And I'm not going to make excuses one way or the other for whether or not there's some bias that exists. But what I will say is that there's been a lot of layoffs, and newsrooms can't do what they did before. We're trying to send somebody into Afghanistan, and the only reason we're able to do it is because they were able to secure a funding grant on their own. There is no way somebody our size could send somebody there to do that kind of journalism or support them. So we're able to put just a few $1,000s in and get this amazing like coverage out. But you know, that's just not always the case. There's things that we're not going to have. And you know, don't beat up on the journalists because we don't have them. We're doing our best.
Yeah, and I'll add to anyone watching and even in conversation, if there is a story that has captured your attention, that you're talking about, that you're sharing, that you're thinking about, support it. Become a member, make a donation, contribute to it. I always feel a bit uncomfortable when, as journalists and media makers, we're saying pay for news. So I always like to say, when you are moved, when you are glued to a news organization, trying to make sense of the world, it's that moment. If you want more of it, contribute.
We just have a couple minutes left. We probably won't get to that audience question, actually. I guess we're almost out of time. But quickly, Ty, what would you sort of say to Canadian consumers to get them to support news?
Yeah, same thing. Like if you love it, just subscribe. Like for us, it's a free newsletter, right? And then ultimately take the next step, help support it, fund it, get a tax receipt in our case because we're an RJO. But I think for us also, I think, yeah, like it's hard work, right? Like a lot of our stuff is long form, it's investigative, takes a while, and you publish and you don't know, you know, what the reaction is. So, you know, our writers or journalists love it when the audience writes back just a simple email, say, hey, that was an amazing piece. You know, it really changed my mind about something. So that kind of feedback, I think, goes a long way for, you know, the hard, tireless work that some of us put into this stuff.
Emma?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really simple, right? Like take when you are moved by the news, like take one simple step. You know, it doesn't need to be right to donating or becoming a member or subscribing, but most of us have free newsletters, and get on one of those and get it in your inbox because you're not going to stumble upon us in your social media feed anymore. So take that on and share the news with people that you know too. You know, share it. Good old word of mouth, and that, you know, that really makes a huge difference. And I think, like for all of us, it's like, you know, we have to break stories and tell compelling stories that bring people to us and make them feel things and make them feel compelled to support the news. That's our job.
Matthew, last word to you.
I mean, I can't beat what Jennifer's already said. And I think given the loss of social media, word of mouth is really going to be so important. So I know I see the frustration of people online as they're trying to share stories and they realize suddenly that it's not there anymore. So, you know, over the dinner table, over at your workplace, wherever, when you see those stories that move you, share them, talk about them, mention the outlets, talk about the journalists who produced them. I don't know how this is going to work, but I think that's maybe a really good place to start.
All right. Well, we have 1 minute left. Just Walalio, thank you everyone for this conversation. There is time, I guess. We still have you know, to see how this plays out, to see what happens with Google then. But thank you all for your insights and for this conversation, and for the people who joined to watch, and have a good evening. And Walalio, thank you very much.
Thank you, Trina. Thanks,
Yeah,
audience.
thanks, Trina.
Thank
Everyone.
you.
Bye.
Everyone.